Okay, we're going to be talking about Japan before 1333. And this video, I'm going to highlight a couple of main pieces looking at what are called flame style vessels from the Jomon period, as well as the pagoda, and then also warrior sculptures from Hanawa. Okay, so to begin, I want to talk about the lifestyle that we might have seen at the very onset and beginning of Japanese culture and before civilization. And that is during that Paleolithic, Neolithic period. And during that time, there was not a lot of glacial covering in the area, so they were still very island-esque and remained heavily in the clustered islands that are Japan and what is surrounding Japan. So, with that being said, I want you to know that they were hunters and gatherers, but they didn't move around or migrate around a lot. There wasn't a heavy focus on following deer. It was about fishing. So their flesh and their meat came from the fish aquatic sources and not from the mammal source. So there wasn't that much interest in moving around and following migrations of herds and bulls and all that. It was very much about casting your line out, your nets out into the waters and grabbing that fish. That's their main source of protein, coming from the fish. And we'll see this interest in the cords and in rods and in different textile-like items that were used for this fishing present in the artwork. It has a very what's called corded look, and that's what segues into this first period that I want to talk about, which is the Jomon period. Because Jomon, Jomon, actually means cord, as like a cord of fabric or a cord of burlap or a corded rope. It literally means cord. So if you look at figure 17.2, you can see what I mean by that. And what the artists are doing is they're taking what are called coils out of clay, and they're constructing the overall surface or overall shape of the flame style vessel. Then, after they make the overall general shape, they come back with smaller cords or coils, and they cord them together to create different patterns that are three-dimensional throughout the entire vessel. Now, the Japanese, were the first to focus heavily on individualized sculptures. They weren't too concerned about having to move around and chase the reindeer and all that. They were self-satisfied very early whenever it comes to the natural needs of nourishing the body. So they've had more time to actually focus on making artwork and stay localized and regionalized, almost like a pre-civilization to the rest of the world. And that has allowed them to create more artwork much earlier in time than what we were seeing in the western parts of the world. Okay, so they were the first, really the earliest documented in art of Japan is here in the Jomon period, with these cord-like pieces of pottery and vessels. But they were the first to really settle down. Their Paleolithic was really their Neolithic, and their Neolithic was really their civilized ancient civilization. So they were many, many, many years ahead of what's going on in the western parts of the world. And that's also to be said about India too. They were way more localized and regionalized before the rest of the Western world was coming out of that last ice age. They actually made these pots before they started getting into agriculture, because a lot of their main activities relied on the oceanic waters, so the Pacific. So gathering water from pools of water that have extracted the salt from the ocean water, as well as freshwater sources around the ocean, around the beach lines, and of course gathering fish. So a lot of the stuff that they're making and using is in relation to getting over to the waters and collecting what they need. All right. So when I'm talking about that, when I'm describing the necessity for gathering fresh water as well as fish and other forms of protein coming from the ocean, we call that utilitarian. So that means that the artwork that they're making and that they're using has a utilitarian function. That's Utilitarian, utilitarian. That means that it's meant to hold something to function for food, either food or water. Okay? Like a plate that you eat off of, a bowl that you eat your cereal out of. Those are utilitarian objects. They're meant for the everyday use. Okay? But this flame style vessel is meant to take the utilitarian concept of gathering water, having this ceramic basket that gathers fish, and bring it back to the village, bring it back to the group. And it's meant to be augmented to become sculptural. So now they're taking these utilitarian forms and then they're adding sculptural features like the corded coils to create these patterns and these shapes throughout the rim of the piece, on top where you see all the undulations and the fiery like surface on the top, and then the oceanic curves of the coils throughout the rest of the body. So it's supposed to incorporate or encompass the waters and the fires, and that the waters bring upon the need for something to be cooked on a fire, right? Like fish or vegetation or whatever it may be. So these pieces are meant to be this utilitarian in nature at first, but then they become sculptural. And that's the function, is for them to become aesthetically pleasing to the eye and to tell this symbolic or this pattern narrative of that going back and forth between the land and the water. Okay, so utilitarian and sculptural. So how this works, how they make this, is they'll patty out a slab of clay in their hand, something similar to this coaster. Okay, very thick base, solid piece of clay. And you could do this by taking a ceramics class. Is that these projects are made in most ceramics classes, wherever you go. You'll choose a different part of history and you'll focus on the cultural relevance of that pottery and that ceramics for that culture. Okay, so when I teach ceramics classes, that's what I do. You pick a different time in the world, you make that object again, all right, just like they did in 2500 BCE. But anyway, you start with a flat slab. It's called a slab of clay, S-L-A-B, slab. Then you score it. And scoring is cutting into the clay with a fork or with a sharp tool. All right, you could use like a sharp piece of flint and stone. That might have been what they used, just a sharp piece of rock. They might have whittled down their own, because they're very good at woodworking as well, clay and woodworking in particular. They might have whittled down their own instruments and scored, S-C-O-R-E, scored the surface of the clay. Then they impact water or a liquidous clay, and that liquidous clay is called slip, S-L-I-P, slip. Then they roll out a coil that's the same thickness as the base slab, and then they impact it into that scoring mark. All right, and then they also score on the underside of that coil before they impact it. So you create two perpendicular teeth. So you have a cut going this way on the slab, and then you have a cut going this way on the coil, and then they interlock. All right, and it locks it together. Then you have to smooth it out with your thumb, or maybe a piece of gourd or a tool that's smooth in nature. And each coil that you add, you smooth out with your thumb, and it slowly gets bigger and bigger. And then it gets to a point where the gravity is going to sag at the moisture level of the clay that you have to stop or work on it next to a fire, keeping it rotating as you're working on it, so the moisture can slowly drive itself out of the project. Then once you get the overall shape, you try to get the overall shape. This is 2 feet high, so this is 24 inches tall. All right, it's very tall. But most likely they got to about 18, 19 inches, which is the rim of the piece, which would look like an ice cream cone without all those extra appendages added to the top. They hurry up and try to get that done in the same day. Then they come back and start scoring the body or the surface area of the flame style vessel with the same technique as they did when adding the coils, but they're adding smaller coils around the surface of the piece. And then they'll do that first because the bottom will dry out before the top, because that's where you started the project and the moisture is going to dry out faster down there. Then they get up to the rim and they start adding thicker pieces of coils and slabs to build on top of the rim to give you that flame style pattern that you see going on all the way around full circle. All right. Then they come back in with the coils to create looped handles that you see to the far left of the image. And that's how one of these pieces was constructed. Most likely, not one of these pieces was made at one time, like in one sitting. They probably had 2 or 3 in tandem going on at once. Or maybe they collectively shared them. All right, it got to a point where somebody worked to a certain height, you hand it over to the next person, they work on the next section, and you work on the next section of the piece that something's been handed over to you. I'm not for sure. I don't want to speculate on exactly how they communally design these things, but I do know that the Japanese, throughout their history, have been communal in nature, and it's very much about sharing and giving. All right, so that's how these are made. So this was made during the middle Jomon period. And remember, you're going to need to know this, that Jomon, Jomon, means cord, chord. So it looks corded, like corded jeans, okay? It has that fabric-like feel to it. And the inhabitants, the residents during this Jomon period, they lived in holes. Okay, very much like what we saw in the Neolithic period in the United Kingdom and up through Ireland and Scotland, or Scotland first, then Ireland. The homes were buried in the ground, and then thatched roofs as well as some stone structures on the side kept everything together. Kept the roofs together, all right, and just have deteriorated and decayed over time. Now, United Kingdom and Japan are both islands, so we believe that this is very much an island-esque style of living in these holes. And these excavations during the Jomon period are proving that they lived very similarly to the inhabitants of the United Kingdom during the Neolithic period, okay? So there's big similarities. And again, this is all about creating similarities around different pockets and different areas of the world. So be able to note that, the similarities between their living styles. All right. But they were the first, these Jomon potters, to really create these ceramic, utilitarian, and sculptural pieces. All right. Then we have another coiled piece that's predominantly coiled and slabbed, and that is the Hanawa Warrior from the Kofun period, and that's figure 17.5. And I want you to be able to compare and contrast how textured the flame style vessel was that we just looked at in comparison to figure 17.5, the Hanawa Warrior from the mid-6th century, okay? Looking at close to 3,000 years later. I want you to be able to compare and contrast and see how they're still using similar techniques with clay, all right? You should see that it's made out of low-fired clay called earthenware. That they're using still the similar techniques that they did, 3,000 years back, around 2500 BCE, as they are now, all right, or during this mid-6th century period. But they're smoothing things out, and the imagery is more narrative and figurative, describing what's going on in this period of Japanese culture versus what was going on that was pattern and symbolically based in around 2500 CE. All right, so compare and contrast the differences and similarities. Then we have the pagoda. Let's see, which one do I want you to look at? I want you to look at figure 17.9a. All right, 17.9a. And one of the first things I do want to mention about the pagodas, before they were built out of wood, they were designed out of clay. So they made clay sculptures on what the pagoda was going to look like once it was constructed out of wood. So clay was such a salient, a crucial material being used to get things going and to get different techniques expressed and developed and generated throughout Japanese history. Okay, and it's no different than architects today. They create 3D modeled diagrams of what the architecture is going to look like after it goes through the vector software on the computer. Then it's generated out of different three-dimensional materials to show the scale of what it's going to look like in comparison to its environment that it's going to be in. And then that's presented to the individual who's commissioning that piece of architecture to be built. So that's what they would do. They would use the clay models to show what that pagoda is going to look like to the commissioners of building that pagoda. So it started in clay first. They have, you look at the angles and the curves of the roof on the pagoda, that's what we call a pitched roof with a raised beam system. A pitched roof with a raised beam system. These pagodas also develop new architectural themes that are going to be used throughout the world as time progresses forward. And they're going to use the post and lintel system, which is something that the Romans used. Okay, but with brackets. So they're going to have brackets on the end of the post and lintel system so that the framework can go back in a rectilinear way. So instead of just being frontal post and lintel, remember a post is your vertical, your lintel is your horizontal. Instead of it just being frontal with post and lintel, it's going to go to the edge and then it's going to move back and recede into space, creating a square-like base structure that we can see at the bottom of the pagoda. And then it's going to be bracketed in using joinery. It's wood joinery on itself, so interlocking pieces of wood. No metal or anything like that, okay? Just wood locking into wood. Then from there, with those brackets, they're going to start to be some of the first to use what are called struts. S-T-R-U-T-S. Struts. And these were raised up from the lintel beams. So remember, the lintel were the horizontal. Then they would use struts to elevate to create another line of wood interlocking above the post and lintels, which allows for the pitch of the roof. Okay? So with each pagoda section, it pitches up to allow for another a ceiling or a pitched roof, and then that's strutted up to create the next layer, and you can see it struts up 1, 2, 3, 4 times before it hits the top main roof where it has that antenna running through the middle. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the religious elements and all of those. I'm just going to talk, I just wanted to talk about the basic architectural, which is part of the visual arts element to the pagoda. All right, so be able to look at the Jomon vessel, look at the Hanawa Warrior, and then also look at this pagoda 17.9. All right, I'll leave you at that, and we'll get moving into the next chapter.